In Maine's winter of 2015, hunter Daniel Harlow stepped into the woods and never came back. His family called police, but snow buried tracks before daylight. Searchers found only faint blood on white ground, and locals quickly whispered other stories: a storm swallowing him, or spirits claiming the careless. Relatives pinned a folded hunting map to their wall, marking circles with trembling pencils as tips and rumors collided. What remained was silence, until spring thaw revealed bones and a hidden rifle. In the end, courtroom lights burned away the myths, but the family still remembers the moment red melted into snow. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Snow had settled across the back roads of Maine in late January 2015. The kind of snow that packed itself into drifts higher than a fence post and turned every sound into a muffled echo. The pine forest looked almost weightless under the white load, but anyone who lived here knew how heavy it truly was. Hunters like Daniel Harlow grew up respecting that silence. At 38, he was known for keeping strict patterns, a man who moved by the clock and by the weather. When skies darkened, he came home. When storms rolled in, he was already by the stove with a coffee. On the morning of his disappearance, Daniel left before dawn. The porch light caught his shape as he carried his rifle and thermos. Marianne, his older sister, heard the door creak but didn't rise. She knew his routine by heart. He always tucked a folded hunting map into his jacket pocket. The map was worn soft at the edges, creased and smudged from years of being unfolded on stumps and truck hoods. It was nothing special, just the sort of map you could buy at a local gas station. Yet it guided Daniel every season, every trail marked with pencil notes only he could read. By noon, when Daniel usually returned, the chair at the table was empty. Marianne glanced at the clock, then back at the window. Snow was falling harder, sifting sideways, cutting visibility down to yards. She told herself he might be tracking a deer, just taking longer than usual. By 4 p.m., shadows stretched across the yard, and the sky had sunk to that slate color that meant night was already pressing in. Marianne called Eli, their younger brother. Eli lived 2 roads away, and within 30 minutes his headlights glowed against the storm. The two stood on the porch, their boots sinking into fresh snow. The words they exchanged were clipped, almost rehearsed, as if they had practiced for this kind of worry before. Daniel would not simply stay out in weather like this. He knew better. At 6 p.m., Marianne dialed the county sheriff. The deputy on duty suggested Daniel might have chosen to camp overnight, a thing hunters sometimes did. But the siblings knew better. Daniel was cautious, even predictable. He never risked a night in the open when the temperature dropped this fast. The deputy promised a daylight search, but his tone carried little urgency. That wasn't enough. By 7 p.m., a small group of neighbors had arrived with lanterns and flashlights. They were farmers, woodcutters, old friends of the Harlow family. The search began at the tree line, beams of light bobbing as they stepped into the hush of the forest. Snow shifted beneath their boots, crunching, then closing again as if swallowing sound. They followed a faint trail, prints that seemed to belong to Daniel's boots. 100 yards in, Eli's light froze on the ground. Against the white crust of snow, tiny beads of red dotted the surface. The sight silenced the group. Marianne knelt close, her breath clouding the air. Someone muttered that it could be a wounded deer. Someone else whispered that Daniel might have cut himself. But the drops were scattered just enough to suggest movement, a living thing bleeding as it walked. Marianne reached for Eli's arm as the wind rose. The flakes began to cover the red, soft and fast. Within minutes, the stain thinned, smearing into the ground as if the forest itself was reclaiming it. They pressed further, fanning out, but the storm worsened. Flurries blurred the lights, and the boot tracks soon vanished under shifting snow. Every few minutes, someone would shout Daniel's name, the voice drifting away into branches heavy with ice. The only answer was wind. By 9 p.m., the sheriff arrived with one cruiser, his demeanor calm, almost detached. He ordered the search paused until morning, citing risk of exposure. The neighbors argued, but the storm made the decision for them. Lanterns sputtered, batteries drained, and the cold gnawed through coats. Reluctantly, they turned back, each step heavier than the last. Inside the Harlow house, the family gathered around the kitchen table. Marianne unfolded Daniel's hunting map, smoothing its creases with trembling fingers. Eli placed a pencil circle near the ridge where they had found the blood. The paper seemed fragile beneath the weight of their marks. Until that night, the map had been nothing more than Daniel's tool. Now, it sat like a relic, half guide, half shrine. Neighbors drank coffee in silence, steam rising while snow tapped against the windows. Some spoke quietly of hunters who had vanished before, men caught in sudden squalls and never found. Others shared older stories of cursed groves and restless spirits that pulled travelers astray. Marianne listened, her eyes fixed on the circle drawn in graphite. Belief and fact tangled in the room, one side murmuring folklore, the other staring at evidence of blood. No one slept. Marianne kept the map open, her hand resting on its edge. Outside, the storm roared, burying every trail and every trace. It was as if the woods themselves had closed their mouth around Daniel, holding whatever truth they carried. By dawn, the only certainty left was a folded map and a silence too deep to break. The map lay open, a silent witness to vanishing. Morning brought no relief. The storm had cleared, but the forest looked transformed, every hollow and ridge buried in a new layer of white. By 7 a.m., county deputies assembled with a dozen volunteers at the edge of the Harlow property. Marianne stood on the porch, clutching a mug that had gone cold, watching them prepare. Eli moved among the group, restless, pointing out where tracks had been visible the night before. His urgency contrasted with the sheriff's steady, almost detached instructions. The deputies marked out search grids, using orange tape on branches, each line meant to guide them back. But the snow erased more than just footprints. It erased certainty. When they reached the spot where the blood had been, only a faint depression remained, no color visible. Marianne bent to look, but all she saw was the pale glaze of ice that had formed overnight. A neighbor, an older man named Whitman, shook his head and muttered. He claimed Daniel had once spoken of a figure in the woods, a stranger in heavy clothing glimpsed near dusk. Whitman swore he had heard it himself weeks before. A branch snap, then a shadow moving quick. Others picked up the story, voices low, until the rumor itself became another presence in the clearing. Belief spread fast, the way it always did in small towns. The deputies dismissed the tale. To them, Daniel had likely wandered too far and succumbed to weather. Still, the family clung to both possibilities, the rational and the whispered. Marianne pulled the folded hunting map from her coat. She laid it across the hood of Eli's truck, pressing her gloves flat against it to keep the wind from catching the edges. With a pencil stub, she circled the stand of trees where the rumor claimed the figure had been seen. The line wavered, graphite dark against the pale green of paper. The search moved deeper into the forest. Volunteers formed a loose line, lanterns left behind for daylight. The silence was broken only by radio calls, each reporting nothing found as the hours stretched on. At one point, a deputy flagged what looked like a collapsed path, as if someone had stumbled. But it led nowhere. Just snow drifted against a fallen log. A false trace, swallowed up like all the others. By mid-afternoon, the temperature dropped again. The radios crackled with warnings of another front moving in by nightfall. Reluctantly, the sheriff called the search to a halt. Eli protested, his voice sharp, but the deputies packed equipment and drove off, leaving tracks that faded quickly under wind-blown snow. That evening, Marianne pinned the map to the kitchen wall with pushpins. It hung above the table, its folds spread flat for the first time in years. Each circle now looked less like a guide and more like a warning. Family and neighbors gathered again, staring at it as if the paper might speak. Some still repeated the rumor of a stranger in the woods. Others whispered of curses, of hunters lost to the same grove across decades. Eli pushed back, insisting they needed evidence, not superstition. Yet when he traced the pencil circle with his finger, even he paused, as if the paper itself carried an omen. By nightfall, the house was filled with silence. The storm returned, wind pressing against the siding. Outside, the forest stood untouched, holding whatever truth it had taken. The map fluttered slightly in the draft, like a living thing on the wall. The third day began with a brittle sky, the kind that looked clean but carried a cruel cold. Deputies expanded the search line, bringing in dogs from a neighboring county. Marianne watched the animals bound through drifts, their handlers calling sharp commands. The dogs circled, noses low, but gave no solid lead. At midday, one hound froze near a thicket. Eli and 2 deputies rushed ahead. There, snagged high on a branch, hung a dark jacket. It was Daniel's. The fabric was stiff with ice. Sleeves stiffened like arms raised in surrender. Marianne touched it with gloved fingers, whispering his name. The deputies eased it down, examining pockets, empty. One suggested Daniel might have stripped the coat in panic, a sign of hypothermia. Another muttered about a bear encounter. Belief shifted with each guess, each theory competing for air. Yet the details told another story. Along the torn seam clung fibers, stretched not as if ripped by claws, but as if caught and pulled. Eli pressed the cloth against his palm, then released it to the evidence bag. His jaw tightened. The rumor mill stirred again that evening. At the general store, Whitman repeated the tale of a shadowed figure. Someone else claimed Daniel had been drawn into a ritual common among old woodsmen, an initiation that demanded nights alone without fire. To them, the jacket on the branch was a sign of abandonment, a surrender to tradition. Back at the Harlow house, Marianne stared at the map pinned to the wall. She taped the coat's photo beside it, the 2 artifacts forming a shrine. To her, the connection was clear. This was not ritual, not myth. Something tangible had happened in that clearing. Deputies filed a report but gave no promises. Weather forecasts spoke of another storm pushing in. Each delay felt like a closing door. Eli grabbed a pencil and pressed another circle onto the map, this one jagged from the pressure of his hand. Night fell heavy. The coat, sealed now in plastic, still seemed to breathe frost into the room. Marianne sat with the map, tracing circles like prayers, while silence pressed against the windows. In the dark, the empty sleeves of Daniel's coat seemed to lift, shifting with every draft of air. The storm eased overnight, leaving a sky clear enough to see stars, but a ground so brittle that every step cracked like glass. Deputies returned before dawn with more volunteers, promising a deeper sweep toward the ridge where hunters often built temporary camps. Marianne followed them as far as the tree line, then waited with coffee in her hands, the map folded under her arm. Eli went with the searchers, refusing to stand still. By mid-morning, the line of orange tape and dark figures had disappeared into the trees. Hours passed without word. Marianne sat in the truck with the heater running, staring at the outline of the forest. She imagined Daniel's boots, his careful stride, the way he would always whistle to announce himself when returning home. The whistle never came. At 2 p.m. a call came over the radio. Something had been found. Marianne rushed forward, stumbling through drifts until she saw deputies gathered in a hollow. Smoke residue stained the snow. A ring of stones marked the remains of a fire pit. Charred wood still clung together in shapes of logs, blackened and fragile. Nearby lay a can of beans, unopened, rim crusted with frost. Eli crouched by the stones, eyes narrowed. "He was here," he said flatly. The deputies recorded the site, snapping photographs, marking coordinates. To some, it looked like a camp abandoned in haste. Others whispered it was the kind of ritual camp described in old hunting lore, where men tested themselves by surviving 3 nights without comfort. Whitman, again present, muttered about a trial of the woods, a belief older than the town itself. His words carried weight among neighbors already leaning toward myth, but the evidence pushed another way. On a tree just beyond the pit, bark carried fresh scarring. A bullet had cut deep, leaving a jagged wound in the wood. The deputies pried it free with a knife and placed the warped metal into a plastic bag. It was shiny, uncorroded, its grooves sharp. Eli watched closely, his jaw rigid. "That's no ritual," he said. "That's a shot." Marianne marked the camp on the hunting map that night. She pressed the pencil down hard, sketching a crude cross. The paper, now full of circles and marks, looked less like a guide and more like a battlefield. She pinned it back to the wall, light from the lamp throwing faint shadows across its folds. The family gathered again, murmurs weaving between fact and belief. Some argued Daniel might have injured a deer, then gone chasing it. Others, echoing Whitman, insisted he had chosen a rite of solitude, a tradition whispered among hunters, proof of endurance. Marianne felt the two stories grinding against each other, neither giving way. The forensic scrap of metal lay in a bag at the sheriff's office, but here at the table the tale of ritual seemed stronger. Eli refused to leave the discussion to superstition. He sat with his notebook, listing every physical trace: the coat, the blood, the bullet scar. His notes contrasted with the rumors filling the air. Marianne knew he did it to anchor himself, to keep from slipping into the same fog of stories. Yet even he admitted the camp looked too deliberate, too arranged. Late in the evening, the sheriff visited. He placed a folder on the table, thin but official. Inside were photographs: the fire pit, the unopened can, the bullet lodged in bark. He admitted the evidence was thin. A ballistics test might connect the round to a weapon, but without that weapon it was just another fragment. His voice carried weariness, the tone of a man who had walked this line before, between proof and possibility, between what could be said in court and what lived in rumor. After he left, Marianne stood before the map. The crosses and circles stared back, silent but insistent. The paper had become something more than a tool. It was starting to feel like an altar, layered with belief, evidence, and desperation. Each mark was both prayer and record, belief and fact coexisting on a fragile surface. That night, the house felt colder than usual. Wind slipped through cracks in the siding, rattling the pinned map until it fluttered slightly. Marianne lay awake, watching the wall from her bed, listening for any sound from the woods beyond. Each gust made the paper shift, like a voice whispering in a language she could almost understand. The fire pit remained in her thoughts. It was the first place where Daniel's presence seemed undeniable, the first space shaped by his hands since he left. Yet it also felt staged, abandoned too quickly, as if someone else had stood there, waiting for pursuit. By midnight, the house had gone silent, but Marianne rose again to check the map. Her eyes kept landing on the crude cross drawn at the campsite. She pressed her palm against it, then pulled away, leaving a faint smudge of graphite on her skin. The bullet from the tree sat miles away in a sealed bag, but in her mind she could still hear the echo of a shot cracking across frozen air. Somewhere in the woods, the fire pit had cooled to ash, the bullet scar still fresh in bark. And above her table, the hunting map glimmered faintly under lamplight, a battlefield of circles waiting for its next mark. The fourth day arrived with skies the color of lead, heavy with snow that refused to fall. Deputies gathered again, though fewer this time. Some volunteers had drifted back to their farms, muttering that the search was hopeless. Still, Eli pressed on. He refused to let momentum die. Marianne carried the map under her arm, as if it were part of her own body now. The search line pushed past the camp discovered the day before. Marianne stayed close behind, eyes darting from the ground to the branches overhead. She wanted another trace, another fragment to fight against the silence. Just after noon, one of the deputies raised his hand. Something glimmered beneath the crust of snow near a cluster of spruce. It was a smear of red, frozen into ice. They dug carefully, scraping the surface with gloves until the mark revealed itself fully. Blood. The deputies conferred, then slipped a sample into a tube. Hours later, the call came back from the lab. It matched Daniel's blood type. The confirmation landed heavy in Marianne's chest. The rumor of ritual had power, but this was fact, logged and sealed. yet belief did not surrender. At the edge of the forest, Whitman spun another story. Daniel had angered men involved in poaching. He spoke of a hidden trade in venison and bear parts, suggesting Daniel had been silenced. Others nodded, hungry for explanation. The idea spread quickly, another red herring clouding the truth. Marianne listened, lips pressed tight. At home that night, she tacked a red pin onto the hunting map where the blood had been found. The map had grown crowded, circles, crosses, notes scribbled in pencil. Now the red pin pierced it, a wound made visible. To Marianne, it looked like the page itself was bleeding. The sheriff arrived again, this time with little more than caution. He reminded them that evidence did not always tell a complete story. A blood sample could place Daniel in the forest, but not reveal how he vanished. His words offered no comfort. The family wanted more than fragments. They wanted clarity. In the kitchen, the map had taken on new weight. Neighbors stared at it as though it were scripture. Each mark became a verse in an unfinished gospel of disappearance. The red pin in particular drew eyes. Some touched it with their fingertips, as if it carried warmth. Others avoided it, unsettled by the way it seemed to radiate accusation. Eli added his own note beside the pin. Confirmed blood. His handwriting pressed hard into the paper, nearly tearing it. He had begun keeping a separate ledger too, documenting every detail. It was his way of anchoring against the swirl of rumor. Still, even he felt the pull of stories, hunters silenced for crossing territorial lines, men swallowed by their own secrecy. By evening, Marianne sat alone at the table, staring at the wall. The map's surface, lit by a single lamp, seemed to shift under shadow. She thought of Daniel's steady hand folding that paper after every hunt, his pencil marks clear and deliberate. Now, her own marks layered over his, a palimpsest of belief and fact. Outside, the wind rattled branches against the siding. Each scrape sounded like claws, echoing the deputy's first theory of a bear. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. The blood had been real. The red pin was proof, but proof alone was not yet truth. And on the wall, the hunting map pulsed with silent weight, a wound nailed into paper. Morning returned colder than any before, a hard freeze that left frost on the inside of windows and stiffened the hinges of doors. Marianne rose early, lit the stove, and found herself staring at the hunting map before she even poured coffee. It loomed above the table now, larger than its paper size, swollen with the meaning forced upon it. Every pin and mark glowed in the lamplight like wounds stitched into flesh. Eli came by before sunrise, his boots caked in ice. He carried a small satchel filled with supplies, extra gloves, a thermos, a notebook he had begun to call his ledger. He laid it on the table, pages already crowded with notes. Blood sample confirmed, coat found on branch, fire pit coordinates. He had even taped in Polaroids, grainy but insistent, making a record no one could erase. Marianne touched the book as though it were fragile, but Eli snapped it shut. "We keep this until the end," he said. By mid-morning, the search shifted further north. Deputies seemed weary, their interest waning. But Eli's determination pushed them toward the ridgeline, a place Daniel had often hunted. The snow here was deeper, shadows longer between the trees. Every crunch of boots echoed, the sound bouncing strangely. It was Eli who saw it first, a metallic glint half buried beneath ice. He scraped at the crust until a brass casing rolled free into his palm. A shotgun shell, not the caliber Daniel used. The deputy marked it, tagged it, bagged it, the motions mechanical. One suggested it might be years old, lost from another hunter. But the casing looked clean, the metal sharp, unweathered. Marianne watched the exchange in silence, anger coiling in her chest as the deputy shrugged it off. Eli snapped a photo, then held the bag high. "This is not Daniel's," he said firmly. No one answered. Rumor followed close behind. Whitman, standing further back with neighbors, muttered that the shell could have come from local poachers. Another voice suggested rival hunters angry over territory. Belief bloomed quickly, filling the void where official response faltered. Marianne listened, each word dripping like poison into the room of possibilities. That night, the family reconvened at the table. The casing lay in its bag, sealed with tape, a number scrawled in black ink. Eli drew another circle on the map, then scribbled a question mark so hard the pencil tore through the page. Marianne pinned the casing's photo beside the blood pin. The wall now looked like an evidence board, each mark tethered by invisible lines. Neighbors visited again, filling the kitchen with murmur. Some leaned toward folklore still, saying Daniel had been taken by the forest, by spirits who punished trespass. Others clung to the poaching story, imagining secret economies hidden in the pines. Between the two layers, fact struggled to stay visible. The bullet casing existed, sealed and numbered, yet it seemed weaker than rumor. Marianne sat back, exhausted. She looked at the map, now scarred by circles, crosses, and notes. Once it had been Daniel's tool of choice, folded neatly in his pocket. Then it became her guide, then a shrine, then a battlefield of theories. Tonight it felt almost like an oracle, each mark vibrating with stories that refused to settle. Later, when the neighbors left, the house grew quiet. Marianne remained in the kitchen, staring at the map. A draft moved through the room, rattling its paper edges. The casing's photo shifted slightly under the pushpin, tilting, as if trying to slide off the wall. She steadied it with her hand, then held her palm against the map's surface. It was cool, smooth, yet alive with the pressure of every mark. She remembered the night they had first found blood in the snow, how quickly the flakes had swallowed it. She remembered the coat swaying on the branch, the fire pit still warm. Each fragment told one story, but the town had already layered another. Belief versus fact, rumor against evidence, the dual narratives grinding louder each day. Eli returned from the porch, shaking frost from his cap. "They'll forget," he said quietly. "The deputies, the neighbors, they'll let it fade, but we don't." He placed his ledger on the table again, flipped it open, and added one more line. "Casing, foreign caliber, location marked." His handwriting was cramped, but steady. Marianne nodded. The stove snapped as wood shifted, sparks flaring behind the glass. Outside, the wind had died. The silence pressed heavier than before, the kind that felt like being buried. Marianne thought of Daniel alone in that forest, the weight of snow closing in. She wondered if he had dropped the casing himself, though she knew the caliber was wrong. The uncertainty gnawed at her, sharper than hunger. Near midnight, she stood before the map again. The red pin gleamed under lamplight, the question mark carved into the paper below it. She could almost hear whispers in the folds, a chorus of theories. She reached up and pressed her fingertip to the map's surface, aligning her skin with the pencil marks, as if touch alone could draw Daniel back. The map no longer belonged to one man's pocket. It had become the room's heart, pumping rumor and fact together until neither could be separated. In the dark silence of the kitchen, the brass casing gleamed faintly, its shadow stretching long across the table. By the fifth day, the forest felt different, as though the trees themselves leaned closer, listening. The official search had lost momentum. Deputies now arrived late, left early, their radio chatter thin with half-hearted reports. But neighbors kept showing up. Each brought stories, and the stories kept multiplying. Whitman, never far from the search, insisted that Daniel had been haunted. He claimed hunters before him spoke of a young man lost decades earlier, a spirit doomed to wander ridges and mislead others. To Whitman, the empty coat and the bullet casing were not evidence of crime, but of curse. A few nodded, repeating fragments of local legend, each retelling adding weight to belief. Eli refused to indulge it. "We are looking for facts," he snapped more than once, pointing to the sealed bags that held fibers, shell casings, samples. But whispers carried further than reason. Marianne heard them in the store, in church, even at the post office. Daniel's disappearance was becoming myth before it had become case. That afternoon, a deputy flagged tire impressions near the forest road. They looked fresh, pressed deep into mud beneath melting snow. Marianne knelt to study them, tracing the grooves with her glove. They didn't match Daniel's old truck, parked still at the cabin. Someone else had driven there. The find should have changed everything, but instead it deepened the split. Belief argued that the marks meant little. Hunters came and went, loggers too. Fact demanded they be logged, measured, cast. The deputies took photographs, but Eli muttered that they would never follow through. At home, Marianne copied the shape of the tire tracks onto the hunting map. She didn't know why. Perhaps to make the fragments solid. The pencil lines curved across Daniel's own notes, rewriting his world. The map now bore circles of blood, crosses of camps, pins of evidence, and now the parallel grooves of tires. It had become a palimpsest of desperation. That night, the house filled again. Neighbors came with thermoses, loaves of bread. Stories carried like currency. Some spoke of feuds among hunters, men who drew invisible borders in the forest and defended them with anger. Others repeated Whitman's curse. Belief spread warm in the room, easier to share than silence. Eli sat apart, scribbling in his ledger, every word mechanical. Marianne stayed by the wall, staring at the map. To her, the grooves she had drawn were not just tracks, but a path pulling them deeper into shadow. The wind rose outside, rattling windows, making the pins on the map tremble. The paper fluttered against the wall, alive in the draft. Marianne thought of Daniel's careful folding, how he always pressed each crease. Now it hung wide, edges frayed, as if refusing to close until the story was finished. The deputies left before midnight, their cruiser's taillights swallowed by trees. The neighbors drifted off one by one. Only Marianne and Eli remained, the map glowing under lamplight. Eli tapped his notebook, insisting the tire tracks were real evidence. Marianne nodded but said nothing. In her mind, the two voices, belief and fact, kept circling, clashing like storm fronts. She lay awake long after, listening to the night press against the house. The sound of wind in the trees grew louder, twisting into shapes almost like voices. She could not tell if it was imagination or if the forest itself was trying to speak. On the wall, the penciled tire grooves seemed to stretch, curling into the map's folds like roads to nowhere. By the end of the week, fatigue had set in. Deputies dragged their feet through the snow, their radios clipped silent at their belts. Volunteers grew fewer. Even Eli looked older, lines set deep from sleepless nights. But the forest gave one more fragment, as if it had been holding back. It happened near midday, when a woodcutter from town joined the search. He was a quiet man, known mostly for hauling timber alone. His dog bounded ahead, nosing into a hollow trunk. The man shouted, drawing Eli and Marianne over. Wedged inside the rotted cavity, wrapped in a thin film of ice, lay a rifle. The deputies moved quickly now, gloves on, evidence bags ready. The barrel was pitted with rust, but the shape was clear. The serial number plate had been scraped down, scratched into illegibility. Eli leaned close, his breath clouding white, while a deputy snapped photographs. The weapon looked abandoned, hidden rather than dropped. Belief surged immediately. Whitman muttered about cursed guns, weapons left behind by spirits. Another volunteer claimed it might have belonged to a hunter years ago, lost in storms and only now revealed. Rumor rose like heat, spreading even before the rifle left the hollow. But fact pressed through. The deputies compared grooves on the barrel to the bullet pulled from the tree at the camp. Later, tests would confirm the match. Still, in the clearing that afternoon, no one knew for certain. The rifle sat in a sealed bag, carried like a relic. Marianne felt her heart pounding as she watched it disappear into the evidence case. The object seemed heavier than its weight, a thing tied to violence. Back at the Harlow house, the map gained another pin. Marianne pressed a blue tack into the paper where the rifle had been found. Now the wall resembled a battlefield more than a guide. Red for blood, circles for rumors, crosses for the camp, and the blue for the gun. Threads of meaning ran between them. Lines invisible yet unshakable. The house filled with neighbors again. The rifle became subject of endless speculation. Some insisted it was proof Daniel had fallen victim to poachers, silenced for threatening their trade. Others argued it was evidence of the curse, a weapon left behind as warning. Belief and fact collided until the room felt crowded, not with people but with stories. Eli refused to let the rumors rule. He opened his ledger and wrote with careful strokes, "Rifle discovered, serial removed, potential match to casing." He underlined the line twice, as though to anchor it. Marianne copied the coordinates onto the map's margin, her pencil digging grooves into the paper. That night, after the neighbors had gone, the house quieted. The rifle remained locked away miles off, but Marianne could still feel its weight pressing against the air. She stood before the map, staring at the blue pin. It glowed faintly under lamplight, a beacon in the darkness. She remembered how Daniel once unfolded this same paper, how he had drawn light lines to mark trails, never guessing his sister would one day pierce it with pins. The stove crackled, wood splitting with sharp pops. Shadows jumped across the wall, making the map shift and ripple. Marianne thought of the rumors again, how easily the coat had become a ritual symbol, the bullet scar a sign of trial, the rifle a cursed relic. Yet the facts told a colder story. Someone had fired that weapon, hidden it, walked away. Eli entered from the porch, his face raw from cold. He dropped into a chair and laid his notebook open. "This is it," he said. "This gun. Everything ties here." His voice was steady but low, as if daring the room to disagree. Marianne nodded, though unease pressed against her ribs. Forensic detail meant progress, but it also meant confirmation of violence. Outside, the wind moved in long sighs through the pines. The sound carried into the kitchen, seeping between the cracks. Marianne stared at the blue pin until her eyes watered. The map no longer looked like a guide to the forest. It looked like a wound, each mark another cut. Later, alone, she touched the map again. Her fingers brushed over the pins, the pencil circles. The red stains of graphite rubbed deep. The paper crinkled, fragile but resilient, as if it had absorbed not just marks but memory. She thought of Daniel's steady hands folding it, the way he always smoothed creases flat. That gesture had been habit, almost ritual. Now the map was part of the case, part of the evidence, and nothing ordinary remained. The rifle's discovery should have brought relief, a sense that answers were near. Instead, it left the house heavier than before. Rumors still circled outside, clinging to belief that the woods had claimed Daniel. Fact sat silent in evidence bags, waiting to speak in the language of grooves and calibers. The two layers twisted together, inseparable. Marianne extinguished the lamp and left the kitchen. In darkness, the map remained on the wall, its pins catching faint moonlight from the window. The blue tack shimmered like an eye, unblinking, watching the room. The rifle, sealed in plastic, seemed to breathe still from its hiding place. The thaw came slowly, a drip at first, then a steady trickle that turned ditches into streams and softened the crust of snow. By early March, the forest floor began to reappear, muddy and uneven, littered with branches that had cracked under winter's weight. It was in this fragile season, when ice gave way to water, that the searchers finally found what the snow had hidden. A deputy spotted it first along the banks of a swollen creek. Leather, pale and misshapen, jutting from mud. At first he thought it was debris washed down from cabins upstream, but as he pulled it free, the shape of a boot emerged. Inside lay bone. The sight was cordoned quickly. Marianne and Eli stood just beyond the tape, their breath sharp in the damp air. The forensic team moved with quiet precision, uncovering remains that had lain entombed for weeks. Pieces of fabric clung to the bones, a sleeve still intact enough to recognize Daniel's shirt. The air was heavy with thaw, the smell of soil turned over after long burial. One deputy lifted the skull with gloved hands. A hole marked its side. A dark circle through pale bone. Marianne clutched Eli's arm. This was no ritual, no myth. This was violence, yet whispers didn't stop. Some neighbors muttered that animals could leave marks resembling wounds. Others insisted the hole proved the forest curse, a spirit strike that never missed. Belief clung stubbornly, like burrs on clothing, even in the presence of fact. The rifle found earlier was tested. Ballistics linked the bullet grooves to the weapon in the hollow tree. The shell casing from the ridge matched too. Slowly, the fragments drew together, but names had not yet been spoken aloud. The sheriff stayed cautious, telling Marianne and Eli only that the evidence suggested human involvement. It was in the days after the recovery that suspicion finally shifted. Rumors about poachers gave way to more pointed whispers about Raymond Doss, a neighboring hunter who had long argued with Daniel over boundaries in the forest. People recalled heated words, threats muttered in bars. Stories sharpened with each retelling, as though the town had been waiting for a figure to blame. Eli resisted speaking the name at first. He clung to the ledger, listing evidence without drawing conclusions. But Marianne knew. She remembered Raymond's eyes when he spoke of Daniel months before, the clipped tone when he claimed certain ridges as his own. Fact and rumor were converging, closing in on the same figure. At home, the map bore new marks. Marianne pinned another red tack where the creek had yielded bones. She stepped back and looked at the wall. Red, blue, circles, crosses. The paper no longer resembled geography. It looked like a diagram of loss. The map had evolved again, no longer a shrine or oracle, but a case file, a living record. Still, even with the remains identified, uncertainty lingered. The deputies moved cautiously, wary of accusing too soon. Neighbors argued in hushed tones whether justice could ever reach the woods. The forest seemed to resist closure, its silence thick around every conversation. One evening, Marianne sat alone in the kitchen. Rain tapped against the glass, melting the last of the snow. She stared at the map and felt the distance between rumor and fact collapsing. The skull with its dark wound was undeniable. The rifle with its erased number was undeniable. The casing, the coat, the blood, all undeniable. Yet in town, Whitman still whispered about curses. Marianne touched the map with her palm. For months it had absorbed her marks, her fears, her hope. Now it absorbed the final truth. Daniel had been killed. The paper felt thin, stretched, ready to tear. When Eli returned that night, he added a final note to his ledger. Remains located. Skull shows wound consistent with gunshot. He wrote the words with slow precision, underlining each. Then he closed the book and set it beside the map. The two artifacts sat together, mirror images of grief and determination. The forest had given up its secret. What remained was whether people would listen. Outside, the thawing creek carried fragments of ice downstream, clinking like glass. In the kitchen, the hunting map hung still, its surface pierced by pins, a body of paper marked as deeply as the land it described. And from the wall, the red tack glowed under lamplight like an open wound that would not close. The discovery of Daniel's remains shifted everything. Rumors no longer floated free. They began attaching to a name. By the second week of March, the whispers had narrowed to one man, Raymond Doss. He had hunted the same ridges for years, his truck often parked at the forest edge. Old quarrels with Daniel were suddenly retold as warnings. Words spoken months earlier, about trespass, about boundaries, were now sharpened into threats. For a time, the deputies resisted. They had moved too slowly already, and caution had become their habit. But the evidence spoke with more clarity than their reports suggested. Ballistics from the rifle matched the casing. The casing matched the bullet scar in the tree. And the wound in Daniel's skull told the same story. Fact had found its line. It was a neighbor's testimony that pushed the case forward. An elderly farmer came forward, voice shaking, to say he heard a single shot around 4 p.m. the day Daniel vanished. The sound had carried over the ridgeline, sharp and final. He had not reported it at the time. Hunters firing in woods was nothing new, but in hindsight it felt heavy, like an echo he could not shake. The sheriff's office began to move. Raymond was questioned first, his responses clipped, his eyes darting to the floor. He admitted nothing, but the deputies noted the tension in his hands, the sharp edge to his tone. His denial only deepened suspicion. Marianne and Eli waited at home, days folding into nights. The map had become a living witness now, its pins and circles aligned into patterns unmistakable. Marianne stared at it for hours, tracing the path from bloodstain to coat to campfire, from shell casing to rifle to creek. The lines converged, pulling toward one inevitable center. Eli, ledger open before him, recorded each new fact with steady strokes. Testimony, ballistics, wound. He underlined Raymond's name once, then twice. He did not speak it aloud, but the word on paper carried more weight than rumor ever had. When the arrest came, it felt both sudden and inevitable. Deputies drove out to Raymond's cabin, the road half mud, half ice. They brought him in without incident, though neighbors claimed he shouted once. A sound carried down the hollow like a curse. News spread quickly, filling the town with both relief and unease. Belief still lingered. Some insisted Raymond was merely a scapegoat, that the forest's curse demanded a sacrifice. But fact had spoken. The rifle, the ballistics, the wound. The two layers collided, but this time fact did not retreat. In the Harlow kitchen, the map transformed again. Photographs of it were taken, copies made, until the paper itself became part of the case. What once guided a hunter now hung in the sheriff's office as evidence, its folds flattened beneath glass. Marianne stood before the empty wall, her hands trembling. For months it had been the anchor of her grief, the shrine of her hope. Now it was gone, carried into a courtroom. That night silence pressed heavy in the house. The absence of the map was louder than the presence of neighbors, louder than the sheriff's words. Marianne sat with her hands folded, Eli writing in his ledger, the room too bare. When she closed her eyes, she still saw it, the paper riddled with pins, glowing under lamplight. It no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the story the town would tell, to the files that would sit in archives long after. And in her mind's eye, the map stretched across the wall of the courthouse, every mark a scar, every pin a wound. It glared down at all who entered, demanding to be read. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and paper, a place built for order yet echoing with unease. By the time Raymond Doss was led inside, the case had already seeped into every corner of town. Neighbors who once traded rumors now sat in rows, eyes sharp, waiting for the story to be told as fact. Marianne and Eli entered together, the weight of months pressing down. On the wall hung enlarged photographs, the blood drops in snow, Daniel's coat stiff with frost, the fire pit circled with stones. And at the center of it all, framed behind glass, was the hunting map. Every crease visible, every pin documented. It had been admitted as Exhibit 12. What had once hung above a family's table was now evidence before the law. The prosecution moved with deliberate pace. They showed the jury photographs of the bullet scar in the tree, then the recovered shell casing, then the rusted rifle with its erased number. Experts testified how grooves matched, how metal told its story in microscopic lines. A forensic pathologist spoke of the wound in Daniel's skull, a clean puncture matching the rifle's caliber. Each detail fell like a stone, building weight against Raymond. But belief still crept in. Raymond's defense leaned on doubt, suggesting Daniel could have stumbled, that someone else had left the rifle. They hinted at poachers, at unknown hunters, even at the chaos of storms. They did not speak of curses, but the implication of mystery hung in the air. Marianne sat stiff, hands clenched. Each time a photo appeared, blood on white snow, coat on branch, pins in map. Her breath caught. The images were part of her life, now displayed for strangers. She felt exposed, as if her private grief had been unrolled like the map itself. Eli wrote constantly in his ledger, every testimony captured in his sharp handwriting. He underlined words, blood, casing, rifle, as though pressing them deeper into permanence. He looked more like a clerk than a mourner, yet Marianne knew it was the only way he could stand the weight of it. When she was called to testify, Marianne walked slowly to the stand. She spoke of Daniel's habits, of his careful folding of the map, of his predictable returns. Her voice wavered only once when she described the night she pinned the first circle onto the paper. She said she never imagined it would one day hang as evidence. The courtroom listened, silent. The defense cross-examined gently, but their words slid off. Marianne's grief was unassailable. When she stepped down, she felt hollow, as though the map had spoken more than she had. By the third day of trial, the jury had seen enough. Fact outweighed belief. Evidence cut through rumor. Yet Marianne could not escape the image of Daniel's coat swaying on the branch, of blood melting into snow. For her, those images carried more power than any chart or expert. On the final evening before deliberation, she and Eli returned home to the empty wall. Without the map, the kitchen looked bare, stripped of its anchor. Marianne placed her hand flat against the plaster where it had hung, feeling only cool paint. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she saw it again. Creases, pins, pencil marks, all glowing as if alive. In court, the map would be handled as artifact, catalogued and stored. But in her memory, it would always be a shrine. And in the silence of her kitchen, she thought she heard paper rustle, though nothing hung there anymore. Verdict day drew the whole town to the courthouse. The air inside was heavy with anticipation, every cough amplified, every shuffle of shoes echoing. Marianne and Eli sat shoulder to shoulder, their hands clasped, waiting for the jury to return. When the foreman stood, his voice was steady. Guilty. Murder in the first degree. Sentenced to life. The words hung suspended, almost unreal. For months, Marianne had carried fragments, blood melting into snow, the jacket swaying on a branch, the hollowed rifle. Now the fragments converged into a single conclusion. Justice, delivered by strangers in 12 chairs. Raymond Doss sat still as the sentence was read. His eyes darted once toward the gallery, then dropped to the table. No outburst came. Deputies led him away, the chains on his wrists clinking faintly, a metallic punctuation to the silence. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed for comments, their voices sharp, hungry. Marianne said little. "He was my brother," she whispered, then turned away. Eli shielded her from the crowd, guiding her down the steps. Snowflakes drifted again, light as ash, settling on coats and hair. The forest seemed to exhale in the distance, its ridges softened by winter haze. Weeks later, after the trial's noise faded, the sheriff called them in. He handed over a copy of the case file, thick with reports and photographs. Among them was the hunting map, flattened behind archival glass, labeled Exhibit 12. Marianne pressed her hand to the frame, feeling the cold pain instead of paper. The map that once guided Daniel's steps had passed through shrine, rumor, and evidence, now sealed as artifact. Back home, the wall above the kitchen table was bare again. The pushpins had left small scars in the plaster, a constellation of holes. Marianne sat in silence, her fingers brushing those tiny marks. Eli opened his ledger one final time, writing only 2 words: "Case closed." He shut the book, slid it into a drawer, and left it there. Life resumed in fragments. Chores filled the days. Neighbors brought meals, the rhythm of survival returning. Yet the silence of the forest still pressed at night. Marianne often dreamt of snow covering her boots, of following circles on a map that never ended. She would wake to the sound of wind rattling the siding, the same sound that once fluttered the paper on the wall. In time, the state archives would store the map in a steel cabinet, its creases pressed flat, its pins removed. Officially, it was evidence. Unofficially, it remained something else, a memory etched in graphite, a witness that spoke without words. Marianne never asked for it back. Some things belonged to history once they had passed through blood and trial. Yet she often wondered if archivists noticed the smudge of her fingerprints in the corner, the faint blur of graphite where her palm once pressed. Justice had come, yet closure felt thinner. Daniel's whistle, his boots on the porch, the fold of his map, those belonged to silence now. In the quiet of one evening, Marianne sat at the bare table. She closed her eyes and saw the map once more, glowing under lamplight, every mark alive. In her vision, it folded in on itself, crease by crease, until nothing remained but a single square of paper, dark with pins and circles. And in that vision, the map disappeared into the dark vault of memory, sealed away with all it had witnessed. The hunting map folded shut, vanishing behind a locked steel door.